Leave it to me!
Time to sleep. Death comes to me.
Yeah, so this may be the future of Light Season until we get a dedicated counter for this, which may also get a dedicated counter for that because Intelligent System's way of balancing things or providing a quote-unquote counter for something is just to nullify the effect. And this is where we're at right now with saves. Now you can't really use them too much because it could just get shut down by Embla. And unlike offense where you can only put a certain amount of mythics before you start hemorrhaging scoring, on defense it doesn't matter how many you put because as long as you're able to win, then you're losing 0 points anyway. And because of that, you could put 2 Emblas, and you know what that means? No more saves. And as a result, you'll definitely have to think of a way to get around this, because now enemy phase strats for the most part aren't really going to work. Now, of course, that doesn't mean enemy phase is dead entirely with this, but it's definitely going to be much, much more difficult. Unless, of course, you have...
Home is with me. May this land prosper!
But if this is something you can't really do for whatever reason, there are always going to be ways of getting around this type of stuff. And really, the most prominent one that comes to mind is Galeforce. Because Galeforce, you could just go in, defeat all the units, and you don't really have to worry about the enemies after that point. Especially if you were to do it on turn 1, where you have the safety fence. So, in this example, I have Summer Edelgard, who's probably the best Galeforce unit that we have in the game currently, because she can act 3 times, she has her Brave effect, she has Slaying, and she can run Heavy Blade, so no matter what, even if there is Guard, you're going to be able to Galeforce. Unless, of course, they have Guard and Tempo, but that's a really, really niche combination outside of Arvel currently. Still, if possible, you could always just use Summer Edelgard, go in turn 1, attack 3 times on 3 different units, and one of the benefits, especially with going in turn 1, is that you will have the ability to shut off Embla's damage reduction because she only gets it once she's able to get her C slot off. And the only way she does that is at the start of turn 1. And if you could go in turn 1, which is definitely going to be the most prominent time you could go in, then you're probably going to be fine. However, after that point, it's just anybody's game. The units can simply move down like crazy and you'll have to deal with them from there. Of course, with a whole turn or 2, you should have the ability to shut them off by then. And one of the additional benefits to this is that it's relatively cheap for the most part. Outside of Summer Edelgard, of course, Ashe and Peony are free, so you can actually do this quite easily, as long as you have a competent Galeforce unit. But you could also use something like Double Fury and stack up recoil damage so you can end up acting as a Galeforce unit that way. And at that point, it should probably be fine. However, let's discuss the possibility of going in turn 2. Assuming that you can't go in turn 1, you will have to deal with Embla's damage reduction. And for the most part, you're really going to have a harder time getting through it because she just gets an absurd amount of stats on top of the Clash effect and whatever other effects you could possibly give her. It's a lot to deal with on your own. But that isn't to say you can't tank her if you needed to. The only problem after that point is really just everybody moving, because safety fence only works on turn 1. Meaning that if the foes can reach, then you're not going to have any savior protection. At which point you may want to use something like Asker or even Dimitri, or anybody who can face tank a lot of stuff with Bulwark. But even then, there's no guarantee that's going to work. For this composition specifically, I have New Year Dagger here. That way, no matter which side she goes on, she's going to rally, and somebody's going to get way more extended range, which makes this defense even more threatening than it should be. And because more often than not, you're bringing a fair amount of buildings, you're bringing the one that you're required to bring, you're probably bringing a safety fence, you're bringing the bonus building, and then you're probably bringing the escape ladder, unless you're doing some challenge or whatever. Then it's going to be really, really difficult to have any sort of navigation. Because once they have that range, if you don't have the protection, then you're pretty much just dead. Of course, if you have specific units that can counter it, then that's different, but it will ultimately depend on the composition. Still, you could potentially shut it down if you were to bring Milla or Bride Fjorm, which is entirely possible because Milla is also a very popular unit. At least she was way back when, and I assume a lot of people still have her. Even then, if you were to bring her, you could always shut down the rally trap, and the extended range does get neutered a bit, but it is something you still have to watch out for anyway, because after that turn, you will have to fend them off. And in my opinion, this is probably going to be the most prominent thing you can do when it comes to shutting off these potential teams, which I do expect to see more in the future, as this is some of the dumbest stuff we've ever gotten in Fae, in my opinion. Like, we've had Legendary Sigurd, and he was already a pain, but I think this is just a whole nother level of stupidity. And to some extent, you could also use a hit and run strategy, where you take out 2 units on either side. Usually it's going to be the one that isn't littered with traps. You run away, and then you face tank whatever comes your way. Now granted, you would want to stack up your defenses a bit more here, so you can actually survive Embla, but if you are able to attack, run away, and tank, you'll have a lot more wiggle room to work with, which I do think is a really beneficial. And as far as player phase strategies are concerned, these might be the most effective. Now, there are definitely more options at your disposal, but I do think in terms of just effectiveness, Galeforce is probably going to be the best bet. Of course, if you want to gamble and try something in the enemy phase, you have Vantage, and that might be about it. You could always just try to face tank stuff with Brave Dimitri or whoever has a super amount of like true damage reduction, and hope for the best. Although you won't really have backline protection unless you have Bulwark, but even then it's not guaranteed to always work. Still, outside of fighting stupid with stupid, you could potentially try something with Vantage. And Vantage in and of itself can be quite decent, especially for taking on a lot of these frontliners, since a lot of the time they don't run Hardy Baron. However, the moment you run into something with Hardy Baron, it's going to prove a lot more difficult, or Wind Sweep, because a lot of the time units that are vantaging are affected by Wind Sweep. And the problem with that in particular is, outside of a couple of exceptions, a majority of the units that are vantaging, at least the most prominent ones, aren't going to be able to bypass Wind Sweep because most of them are generally slow. And while you could potentially argue the ability of just stacking up defense and res, so even if you have to take a hit in the enemy phase and you could potentially survive, the feud effect that comes with Embla means that you can't stack stats as easily as you once were able to. So the most you're really going to get in terms of just overall stat stacking is visibles. And that might not be enough depending on the unit in question. Maybe someone like Winter Altina could probably do it because her mixed bulk's really good. But if you're looking for someone maybe like Keaton, who is really strong on his own, but doesn't really have a lot of speed and res, if he has to go up against a mage and has to take a hit, no amount of visible stat stacking is going to allow him to survive, sadly. We recently got Ninja Camilla, who's definitely going to be the peak of Vantage currently, because you have res preempt with slang and magic damage, and that's going to do a lot in terms of just Vantage damage output. But outside of her specifically, it might be a bit more difficult, especially if you have to go up against Embla, who has Guard, meaning that if you can't do enough damage, which is going to be a bit more difficult to scale, mainly because you can't use any sort of breath support unless you're infantry, and if you're infantry, you'll have to give up your Sacred Seal for it. And by that point, if you are able to get a special off, that would be great. However, in most scenarios, the only unit that's really going to be able to get a special off against Embla is going to be Keaton, because they have tempo and breath in their weapon. And really, this entire strategy hinges on the chance that the foe doesn't have any sort of Hardy Baron. And if they do have Hardy Baron, or Wind Sweep or Water Sweep, then it's going to prove a lot more difficult to take on. In any case, these are probably going to be the only strategies that work on a consistent basis, but it's easy enough for players to just build around that stuff. So even with Vantage, you have Hardy, or if you were to go up against like Galeforce, you could have something like Gatekeeper, which isn't really going to be that great anyway. But if you can slap Gatekeeper on that team with Embla, then you can shut down any sort of Wings of Mercy beacon chaining, which can be really obnoxious. But whether or not you could fit all those counters in without sacrificing any matchups is hard to say. Still, this is probably going to be the future of Light Season, and you better hope that you can deal with it, because this is going to be something that a lot of people are going to struggle with. Still, that's assuming that you have 2 Embla and the majority of the people are running 2 Embla. I don't necessarily know how common that will be specifically, but if anything, I feel like Embla will show up a lot akin to the likes of Medius, because her presence in Aether Raids is just going to be really absurd. So at the very least, your best bet is to at least try and prepare for 1 Embla. Still, let me know what you think down below. Do you think there's anything else that you could possibly do to counter this type of stuff? Are you going to be pulling for Embla so you could potentially do stuff like this? Are you just going to not play Aether Raids anymore? Let me know. down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.